Commander Riker's roar cracked through the smoke-thick air like a thunderbolt. Who did that? A shout sharpened by 22 years inside the world's deadliest Tier 1 units. A shout powerful enough to freeze every SEAL on the range, because the blast that had shaken the entire compound wasn't in the schedule, wasn't on the training plan, wasn't even remotely expected. The steel target array, rated to survive explosives, high-caliber fire, even anti-material rounds, had been torn apart so cleanly it looked like a blade of light had stabbed through it, leaving a surgical hole still, steaming in the desert heat. And as the smoke curled upward in a twisting black serpent, the SEALs stared with a mixture of awe and panic, whispering theories that sounded far more like myths than reality. Until, through the shifting haze, footsteps began to materialize. Not rushed, not guilty, not hesitant, but steady, measured, deliberate. The kind of footsteps belonging to someone who didn't fear consequences because they already walked with consequences every day. Then a silhouette appeared. Tall, calm, framed by the broken sunlight slicing through the clouds of dust, and when the wind swept the smoke aside like a curtain, the figure walked into full view. A woman in dusty combat fatigues, soot streaked across her cheek, her grip loose on the sling of a long-barrel suppressed rifle whose chilling stillness proved she had fired from far, far away. Every SEAL froze to stone because her entrance didn't just answer the commander's question. It erased it, replaced it, redefined it. Commander Riker stepped forward, jaw clenched, voice rough as gravel as he barked. "Sniper, identify yourself." But she didn't stand at attention, didn't flinch, didn't show fear. She simply wiped the soot from her face with the back of her glove and said, "Staff Sergeant Aria Vale, attached to recon evaluation, sir," in a tone so steady it felt like it had been carved from the mountain cliffs themselves. Riker looked from her to the destroyed steel plate and back to her weapon, noticing the barrel was cold, meaning the shot hadn't been fired anywhere near the range. They were dealing with something far more precise and far more dangerous. He growled, "Where are you positioned?" And Aria simply pointed to the distant ridgelines miles beyond the base perimeter, rugged and hazy, barely visible. The SEAL platoon erupted in disbelief, muttering curses and impossible theories. But Aria walked past them like she'd walked past this reaction 100 times before, dropping a data chip onto the ammo crate. No arrogance, no bragging, just proof. Riker plugged in the chip, and as ballistic data, wind patterns, atmospheric calculations, thermal distortion logs, and real-time footage streamed across the screen, the room fell into a silent awe that felt almost holy, because the numbers didn't just show precision. They showed mastery at a level they didn't even know humans were capable of. "This is beyond Tier 1, Riker whispered, and Aria didn't respond because truth didn't need confirmation from men who still didn't understand the full shape of what had walked into their compound. Just then, the alarm lights flashed. The general recall tone, not for threats, but for high-priority intel briefings. And before the dust from her arrival could settle, a Black Hawk thundered down onto the pad, its rotors chopping the air into a storm of grit and wind. Special operations officers rushed out, calling for all squads. And Aria watched quietly, her eyes narrowing with a faint, almost invisible recognition, as if she already knew why she had been summoned. Inside the operations bay, a projector flickered to life, revealing grainy footage of a convoy ambush. Rangers pinned behind rocks, bullets cracking off stone, drones dropping like flies. The attacking force controlled by hidden shooters positioned across a spider's web of cliffs. "These aren't ordinary snipers," the intel officer said, voice tight. "They're trained by someone, or something, beyond anything we've documented." And before the officer even finished, every SEAL turned their eyes toward Aria, who stood in the back, arms folded, posture relaxed, but presence overwhelming. Riker asked, "What's your max confirmed range?" And Aria answered, 3.2 kilometers, as if she were reading a grocery list. And even the SEAL veterans, men who'd seen legends rise and fall, exchanged looks bordering on disbelief. The mission required an extreme-range neutralization of 6 hostile marksmen who had pinned down NATO teams for 3 days. No drone could reach them. No aircraft could approach without being shot down, and no ground assault could breach the pass alive. Aria only asked for the topographic map, studied it for 18 seconds, then said insertion point here, firing position here, shot window 51 seconds after sunrise. And the room fell into a hush that felt like the desert holding its breath. Hours later, the team deployed at twilight, and Aria climbed alone toward her. Vantage point. Cold wind biting her face, loose stones sliding under her boots, the sharp edge of night cutting across the mountains. But she climbed like it was muscle memory, like she'd been forged from terrain harsher than this. When she reached the ridge, she adjusted her rifle into position, her breathing slowing until even the wind seemed afraid to disturb her focus. And the moment the sun's first light touched the valley, she whispered, "Wind 0.3, thermal drift, right 2 clicks." Shot out, and her rifle exhaled with a soft, deadly whisper. 6.5 seconds later, the farthest hostile dropped, a speck collapsing in the distance, followed by the next, and the next, each one falling before their brains registered the sound of death arriving from beyond any normal battlefield. Below, the SEAL assault team sprinted into the pass, faces full of awe as they crossed what should have been a death corridor, but now was nothing more than a pathway silenced by a ghost. After extraction, when the Black Hawk's engines wound down at the SEAL compound, the entire platoon watched Aria walk across the landing pad. Not with pride, not with swagger, but with the quiet energy of someone already thinking about the next danger waiting over the horizon. But before she could step into the debrief room, an encrypted transmission pinged Riker's wrist unit. Classified clearance, flagged red, marked only with one sentence. Prepare your 7-kilometer range configuration. She will need it. Riker's stomach dropped, because 7 kilometers wasn't a mission parameter. It was an invitation to break the laws of physics. 3 days later, engineers tore apart the base perimeter, installing ballistic receivers, heat arrays, and reinforced plates across a distance so vast it disappeared into atmospheric shimmer. Aria arrived without ceremony, without expectation, without ego, just a soft nod. A rifle case that looked heavier than it should be, and a calmness that unnerved, even hardened. Operators, she stepped into position, studying the 7-kilometer target. Nothing more than a glimmer in the desert heat, and for 10 full minutes she simply breathed, letting the wind speak to her, letting the earth signal its subtle shifts, letting the atmosphere reveal its invisible movements. With a breath soft as a secret, she pulled the trigger, and the shot drifted across the desert. A bullet traveling through invisible rivers of heat and wind, until it kissed the steel plate with a distant clang that echoed back 6 seconds later. No one spoke, no one could, and Riker realized something terrifyingly simple. Aria Vale wasn't breaking records. She was breaking boundaries, revealing that the limits they believed in were illusions built by people who had never walked where she walked. But before she could holster her weapon, the siren blared again. Not a drill, not an exercise, but a threat flag code red. A Rogue State experimental rail-assisted projectile launcher was about to be tested in a desert country thousands of miles away. A weapon capable of striking cities from dozens of kilometers with pinpoint devastation. And as the intel team scrambled, calculating angles and atmospheric drift, one horrifying truth emerged. Only one person on Earth could hit the launcher's exposed ignition core module mid-firing sequence. And she was already standing on the range, her rifle cooling from an impossible test shot. Aria didn't ask for a briefing. She simply asked, "How long do I have?" And Riker replied, 12 hours. And she gave a single nod before boarding a transport aircraft heading toward a mountain plateau so remote even drones rarely passed overhead. The climb alone was nearly lethal. Sheer rock faces, razor-edged ledges, winds that hammered the cliffs like invisible sledgehammers. But Aria climbed with quiet determination until she reached the peak and set up position under the freezing kiss of the night wind. Far in the distance, the weapon ignited, lighting the desert in a blinding arc of white fire. But Aria had already controlled her breathing, aligned her calculations, adjusted for magnetic field distortion and rail-induced atmospheric shockwaves, factors no normal sniper would even consider. And when she finally pulled the trigger, the bullet left her barrel like a whisper from fate itself. 5.9 seconds later, the prototype exploded mid-ignition, sending a shockwave rolling across the desert like thunder chasing dawn, and Aria simply watched, expression unchanging, as history shifted beneath her feet. By the time she returned to the SEAL compound, operators stood at attention, not by command, but because respect demanded it, and Riker stepped forward, voice low, saying, "Aria, you didn't just stop a weapon, you stopped a war from starting." But she simply shouldered her rifle and replied, "War always finds another path," before walking past him toward the debrief room, unaware that her next mission would not target a weapon or a sniper team, but a man some believed was untouchable, a man whose shadow stretched across continents, whose private army hid in mountain fortresses, whose intelligence network rivaled nations. And the only person who could reach him was the woman whose footsteps left echoes even in silence. Aria Vale didn't rest after the debrief. She simply cleaned her rifle in the dim light of the armory, silent and focused, unaware that outside, the SEAL platoon whispered stories about her, stories that spread through the compound like wildfire, stories about impossible shots, smoke-filled entrances, steel plates torn open by bullets traveling distances no one else on the planet could even attempt. But Aria heard none of it, because her mind was already drifting toward the new intel packet Riker had slipped on her table before walking away with that rare expression of a man who had spent his entire life mastering danger only to discover there existed someone who had mastered the impossible. She opened the file and scanned page after classified page, each word sharpening the gravity of the mission. The target was a warlord operating under multiple aliases, a ghost in global conflict, a man whose influence stretched from desert valleys to cyber networks, whose marksmanship matched elite snipers, and whose cruelty left nations trembling. He lived inside a fortress carved into a mountainside, guarded by layers of skilled shooters trained to identify and kill infiltrators from miles away. A place where every angle, every cliff, every rock was perfectly arranged to trap anyone foolish enough to climb toward it. The file detailed failed attempts, special forces teams disappearing without traces, drones shot down, long-range missiles intercepted by advanced jamming, diplomats assassinated from distances previously thought impossible. And yet, despite all of this, Aria felt nothing. Not fear, not excitement, not hesitation, just the familiar weight of responsibility settling into her bones like a cold, silent truth. Because this wasn't about glory or missions or recognition. This was about stopping a man who had made violence a language and terror a currency. At dawn, she boarded a transport that flew her across oceans, deserts, and then into a remote airstrip where a coalition task force brief awaited. Commanders from 3 nations filled the room, and every eye locked onto her the moment she entered. Not with doubt this time, but with a reverence formed not from myth, but from witnessed truth. And the British colonel leading the operation said, "We've thrown everything at this man," tapping the map with a frustrated hand. "Everything but you." And Aria only nodded, studying the fortress layout, noting wind tunnels, heat pockets, elevation shifts, and the steep ridge that would become her path. She traveled by night, transported in an armored convoy through desolate valleys that looked as if the earth itself had been scarred by centuries of warfare. And when the convoy halted at the base of a mountain range, she stepped out into a cold that cut straight through her uniform, but she didn't hesitate. She slung her rifle, adjusted her pack, and began the ascent. Alone, because no one else could follow her route without being spotted, no drone could chart this path without being shot down, and no satellite could map the shifting winds that danced across the cliffs like living creatures. She climbed for hours, gripping jagged stone, pulling herself across narrow ledges where one wrong movement meant death, her breath forming tiny clouds that vanished instantly in the icy air. And when she reached the midpoint ridge, She stopped only long enough to analyze the next stretch of terrain. Unstable, wind-carved, treacherous, and then continued climbing until the sky shifted from black to blue and the sun painted the peaks in gold. Finally, she reached the vantage point. A knife-edge cliff overlooking the valley where the fortress stood like a burned tooth in the mountain's jaw. She set down her pack, assembled her rifle piece by piece, checked each component with mechanical precision, then nestled into the frozen rock as naturally as if she had been born there. Her scope zeroed in on the outer guard towers, each one manned by snipers who scanned the valley with expensive thermal optics. But Aria stayed perfectly still, her body pressed so closely into the earth that she seemed to blend with it. She tracked each guard's pattern, waiting, calculating, breathing slowly until the world shrank into a single sphere of focus when the rotation hit. Its weak point, a gap of precisely 4.3 seconds. Her finger tightened, the rifle whispered, and the tower guard fell before his body even heard the shot. She repeated the motion again and again, her bullets slicing through defensive layers like a ghost peeling away shadows, until the outer perimeter had quietly collapsed. Now came the hardest part. The warlord himself, a man rumored to be a prodigy with a rifle, someone whose instincts were honed to the edge of psychic awareness, someone who could sense a threat before it appeared. Aria scanned the inner courtyard, the windows, the balconies, the rock crevices framing the fortress, searching for the faintest sign of movement until, finally, she saw him, leaning against a railing, flanked by guards, talking into a satellite phone. Unaware that the air itself had already chosen his fate, Aria adjusted her aim, calculating for extreme range. Longer than the distance she'd used to destroy the prototype. Longer than what any recorded sniper engagement had ever achieved. 7,000 meters across jagged terrain, rising thermals, unpredictable pockets of air, and shifting wind currents that would rip a lesser shooter's bullet into chaos. But she didn't see chaos. She saw pathways, invisible rivers of pressure and temperature, subtle dances of wind that others only felt but she understood. She waited for her heartbeat to slow, waited for the earth to pause its breath, waited for that perfect intersection of timing and physics, and then she fired. The bullet launched into the world like a silent destiny, curving, rising, dropping, adjusting with the air like a feather carried by invisible hands, before piercing the warlord's torso with a violent finality that ended a decade of global torment. Chaos erupted instantly, guards sprinting, alarms blaring, radio chatter cracking like fire. But they didn't know where the shot came from, didn't know which direction. Death had traveled, didn't know their threat was already disappearing into the mountains. Aria didn't wait to admire the result. She disassembled her rifle and began her descent, moving quickly, knowing the enemy would send teams to scour the cliffs. She reached the valley floor just as drones buzzed overhead, scanning for heat signatures, but she concealed her presence with cold packs, moving through shadows with a stealth that surpassed training. It was instinct by the time she met the extraction team. The entire task force command center was erupting in celebration, analysts shouting confirmation that the warlord's communications had gone silent, that his troops were dispersing, that his influence was collapsing like a dying star. But Aria simply handed her rifle to the armorer, walked past the cheering officers, and sat alone near the landing pad as the desert wind tugged at her hair. Because victory wasn't something she celebrated. It was a duty, a necessity, a burden, carried by those capable of bearing it. Commander Riker called her on a secure line moments later, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it, saying, "Aria, whatever legend you were before today, you surpassed it." But she only replied, "Legends are myths, sir. I just did what needed to be done," before the call ended and the engines of another Black Hawk roared overhead to take her home. When she returned to the SEAL compound, the men didn't stand at attention. They stood in silence, a deeper respect, an acknowledgement only warriors could give. And as Aria walked through them, her footsteps echoing through the hangar, someone quietly asked, "Who trained her?" And Riker finally answered, "She trained herself. Through failure, through fire, through moments that would break most people." And the base understood something profound. Aria Vale wasn't just the best sniper alive. She was the reason impossible missions had become possible. At the end of the corridor, Riker placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "Your story. It's going to inspire people." And for the first time, a small, rare smile tugged at the corner of Aria's lips as she answered, "Then tell it." Before stepping into the evening light where the sun dipped behind the mountains, she had conquered with nothing but patience, precision, and will. And as her silhouette disappeared into the horizon, a narrator's voice echoed through the screen for those watching on her brave stories. If you're hearing this, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? Her bravery deserves to be heard everywhere.